The different streams are up and running. I think LinkedIn's looking good, YouTube's looking good, and Twitch will do its thing. All right. So, hi. My name is Will Critchlow, founder and CEO at SearchPilot, and I do these live streams aiming for most weeks, often on a Tuesday at this kind of time, which is, if you're catching the stream later, 4:15 in the afternoon UK time, 11:15 a.m. on the East Coast in the US, 8:15 a.m. on the West Coast. And actually, having said that we do them regularly, we're going to be a little summer hiatus for the next couple of weeks. So this is the last one till late August, and keep an eye out on the social media for when I'm back. I'm at Will Critchlow on Twitter and LinkedIn, and this goes out in both places, as well as on the SearchPilot YouTube channel, which is at SearchPilot, if you find that on YouTube. So if you want more resources about what we do at SearchPilot, or more information about things that I've talked about here today, your best bets are two things. Follow us on social, at SearchPilot on all the platforms, at Will Critchlow on all the platforms. And if you head to searchpilot.com/live, that has resources that are particularly of interest to folks who are interested in the stuff that I talk about on this stream. So that's enterprise SEO in particular, SEO testing in particular, which is what we specialize in at SearchPilot. And there are resources there that explain what that is, how it works, how you can find out more information, some customer success stories. If you want a demo of SearchPilot, or you think that our services might be useful for you, there's a contact form that you can use to get in touch with the team. And you can also sign up to our email list there, which is our every other week we publish a test result, basically. And this is the kind of resource that I wish had existed when I was an SEO consultant, which is data-driven results showing things that are actually working in technical and on-site SEO right now. So that's searchpilot.com/live. What we're going to talk about today is more breaking news than I normally do, or than I often do. And in particular, this story that came out, I guess last night, UK time, which was the US antitrust case ruling against Google, saying that the Department of Justice in the US has made this case that the US has abused its monopoly power, its dominance in the market, and has abused that, as I understand it, in particularly in the search advertising market, and that they have various forms of evidence of this, including the ways that they get to spend money to remain dominant and remain with their market share. And I kind of wanted to just break down this news, talk it through a little bit, explain how I see it changing things for marketers in the short term, try and avoid making too many predictions about the twists and turns of any kind of actual cases, and just think through some scenarios and what it might mean for those of us who are entwined and enmeshed with the Google ecosystem one way or another. And I should say, before we start, many of you are probably aware I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not an antitrust lawyer, certainly not a US antitrust lawyer. So none of this is legal analysis. I'm relying on some folks who have done some thinking and heavy lifting on that side of things. And it's not the first time that Google has come under scrutiny for its market power. I think it is still a landmark decision, though, as the Financial Times headline puts it. This is, as I understand, I think the biggest and the most far-reaching of these cases in the US in particular. And there are a lot of differences between antitrust law in the US and Europe, especially. Without getting too deep into the legal details, as I mentioned, I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that there's more need to demonstrate consumer harm, particularly through pricing, in the US, whereas it can be seen as just a de facto wrong in the European market to show that a company has power and wields it in certain ways. Whereas in the US system, they really had to show that not only did it have this monopoly, but that it exploited that to in a way that was damaging to consumers in particular. And so this has been a long-running case. It's taken over 4 months, 4 years, as I understand it. And we've seen all kinds of really interesting evidence and arguments made along the way, we've been extracting kind of interesting information as an industry, as an SEO industry. We've extracted all kinds of interesting information from some of that um, uh, never seen before, newly published information that came out during discovery and during the arguments. This was where a lot of the information around how Google uses clicks, usage data, and a lot of those kinds of previously unknown things, as well as, I mean, the judge calls them out for not being necessarily super transparent in their communication, or not keeping effective records in certain cases. But we've also seen a lot of internal discussion of the ways that they have sought to keep that power and that dominance, which is totally natural, totally understandable. And being a big company is not illegal. Being even a monopoly is not on its own illegal, again, as I understand it. But it's the actions that you take when you're that size, scale, and dominance that are more constrained than they would be for smaller companies looking to do the same thing. And so I think it's fairly unarguable that Google is pretty dominant in the space. We see a lot of these kind of high 80%, low 90% of search market. I think actually the effective number is at least that high, because of the dominance they have in clicks out and the power that they have over the businesses that advertise and seek to appear in organic search results. And so I think this key claim is that ultimately they charged advertisers more than they would have been able to do in a truly competitive search market, and that is what gets passed along to consumers, and that is the consumer harm. I think the first thing to say is, when I started brainstorming how I was going to present this and how I was going to talk about it, I said I wanted to talk about the impact on marketers. And my first instinct was, well, there's nothing short-term. There's no short-term impact on marketers. And the main reason for that is this is going to get ensnarled in appeals and counter-arguments and so on and so forth. There's going to be a lot of back and forth. I've seen some speculation that it could be 5 more years before it actually gets resolved through the court system, during which time a lot of the penalties, which haven't even been assessed yet, are probably not going to be in place. I've since come around to thinking that's a slightly naive view of mine, and I'm going to argue against it in a second and talk about some of the ways that I think maybe we might see some impacts more quickly. But briefly, to touch on the pushback that I anticipate, the shape of the pushback that I anticipate hearing on the Google side as they put together their appeal, a big chunk of it is going to be around market definition. This is deep in the technical minutiae of how antitrust regulation works, but absolutely key to the definition of antitrust is the definition of the market in which you are a dominant force, in which you exert market power. And that is basically everything about these cases. And if you're on either side, the key thing is defining that battleground, defining what market you're talking about. And as I understand it, the DOJ was successful in defining that market in a particularly useful way to their case around, I think, text ads in search, which is a very, very specific market. And Google might seek to, I would expect them to seek to make the argument that actually the market they operate in is much, much broader than just text search, that included should be all of the different ways that people look for products and services, whether that be vertical specific search, the travel search engines and the like, whether it be on e-commerce sites themselves, such as you do on Amazon, for example, whether it be other kinds of searches, some of them also owned by Alphabet, right, YouTube and so forth. But that is going to be an absolute key to this. I've been surprised historically that it took this long to make this argument in the US. It always seemed to me that there's been a lot of fiddling around the edges as these cases have been brought in, particularly in Europe, where they've argued about shopping search results, they've argued about price comparison, they've argued about Google Maps bundled with Android. There's been all these kind of cases that you can argue, but this seems to me the big one: search ads. search ads I mean, I talked a few weeks ago about just what a spectacularly incredible product market fit business this is. This is what did I work it out as? $1 trillion, $250 a year, something like that. Quarter of a trillion is Google's revenue, and I don't remember the percentage, but some very high percentage of that, the majority of that comes from search advertising. And the lens that I often like to just use to contextualize this is you think about all of the people involved in managing the running of Google ads, as in running those campaigns, whether that's in-house, whether that's at an agency. Every paid search agency in the world, add up all of those people, all of those companies' revenue, and you get to a fraction of this one company's revenue. Google is making 10x the total size of that paid search management market. It is just an absolute behemoth. As I said, being big is not illegal, but that seems to me that it has to be the market that they go after, which of course they have now done. So it surprised me that there've been all these other fiddling around the edges of smaller cases, when this seemed to me to be the big one. So, as I say, we haven't even heard the arguments about remedies yet. As I understand it, what happens next is, having decided that Google is guilty, is at fault here, the next phase is to hear arguments. The judge will hear arguments about what the remedy should be to address this. And so this is back to the question of how quickly do we see effects as marketers. They haven't even decided on the remedy yet, never mind implemented it, never mind gone through all of the appeals and everything else that's going to happen. They're talking about everything ranging from preference screens where Google would be forced to show a switcher, a chooser, to say, did you want to try out a different search engine, to we'll talk in a second about mobile devices in particular, because I think that's kind of a key crux of this thing. But they've talked about everything all the way from that kind of chooser, switcher technology all the way to some kind of breakup of, I guess, Alphabet, but potentially even Google itself, or forcing access to search APIs and so forth. I, sticking my neck out here, don't anticipate the remedies going that far. Obviously, there is precedent for breaking up monopolies in US history, and Standard Oil and the steel businesses, the telecoms, AT&T, and so forth. So it wouldn't be unprecedented, but it feels to me a different kind of thing. And I think Ben Thompson writes for Stratechery has outlined this very well. This is a very different kind of monopoly to the kind of monopoly that the industrial titans were famous for building. It's a monopoly less through defensive moats and more through user preferences, which Google rightly says the competition's only a click away. You can go and search on Bing very, very easily, DuckDuckGo, and whatever else it might be. But that doesn't change the fact that there are benefits to scale. There are moats that come from that scale, whether it be the usage data, whether it be the amount that they can pay to remain the default, which is a critical one that we're going to come back to, whether it simply be that they become that default, stay front of mind. Some of the problem comes from whatever the reason is, they are dominant. And when you are dominant, as I said earlier, there are different constraints on what you can do. So I started my career, or my second job was before, and this was actually my last job before I started my own company. I was working in telecoms, and one of the really interesting things about the telecom market, I say really interesting to me as this kind of uber geek, hopefully some of you might find it interesting. When you think about the mobile market, so cell phones, if you're a provider, so you're someone like Verizon or Sprint, or in the US or in the UK, someone like Vodafone, then you have a monopoly on your own customers. So if somebody wants to phone a Verizon customer, they have to interconnect with Verizon. They have to send that data over Verizon's network as at least the final leg to get to that user. And this is, I said data there. Think pre-data, think phone calls. So it has to go over it used to have to go over the Verizon network to connect that phone call to the user's handset. Now, of course, with data, they're much more like dumb pipes, and of course, you can route however you like. So let's set that to one side for a second. Think 10 years ago. Think digital but non-data routed mobile calls, or even 20 years ago. And what that means is that in an unconstrained market, that company could charge whatever they wanted to interconnect with them and to receive those calls, because their customer isn't paying typically, especially in the European and UK markets. This, again, the dynamics work slightly differently, but in the UK, it was always calling party pays. So if I want to phone you, I'm paying. You don't pay anything per minute to receive that call, but I have to interconnect with your mobile provider in order to call you. And so in principle, in an unconstrained market, they could charge whatever they wanted. And what was really interesting so Ofcom is the regulator in the UK that regulates these things. They actually constrained that market. They said you can't charge whatever you like because you have a monopoly over your customers. And that isn't interesting in most walks of life. A bakery having a monopoly over their customers is not interesting to the bread market, because if you want to sell bread, you can just sell through a different bakery and the customers can move. The interesting thing here is that the customers are different people to the person who pays for that call. So the customer of, in this case, say Vodafone, doesn't care what Vodafone charges to 3 for someone on 3 to make a call to Vodafone. And the user doesn't care. And so they're completely price insensitive. They don't care at all. And so you end up with a broken market, because people do care on aggregate how easy it is to phone other people. They just don't care how much their network charges other people. So anyway, this got regulated in the UK. And I always thought it was an interesting analogy that stretched into the search market, because what Google has a dominance of the searcher market. And the searcher, if I'm a searcher, the only way to put an advert in front of me when I'm searching is through Google. Google is the monopoly provider of that search ad for me. And it doesn't matter how many of me there are. Even if you don't have all searchers, whichever searchers you have, the only way to advertise to those searchers is through the search provider's ads system. And it always seemed to me that the market to go after was the search ads market and not the search market. The fact that they're a monopoly in search is true. Competition's a click away. If a better search engine comes along, I can use a different search engine. But if you're a business that's trying to advertise to me, you can't just go and advertise on a different search engine. There's no point. I'm not there. The searchers aren't there. The fact that Google has a monopoly in the search market is only interesting in so much as it gives them a monopoly on the search ads market. And in particular, it's an absolute monopoly on those users who only do their searches on Google. So even though they may only have 80 or 90% of the search market, for that 80 or 90%, they have complete monopoly on the search ads served to those people. Technical, boring, detailed rabbit hole over. Nonetheless, I think that was something that was kind of quite interesting. But so the case seems to have turned in this case on the money that Google has been paying for to be the default search engine. And in particular, this is with, as they say, wireless carriers, browser developers, device manufacturers, but particularly Apple. And in particular, they've paid Apple tens of billions of dollars a year, every year for the last few years. We don't know what that number was over all time, but it is definitely tens of billions of dollars in recent years. And this is so I saw Ben Evans speculating on Threads about this potential abuse here. So the argument, I think, goes Google can only afford to pay this because they're dominant, and they, in particular, because they've got more data about how searches work, and they can monetize better because they monopolize the ads market. Because they monopolize the ads market and they can make more money off these people, they can afford to pay more than any other competing search engine would, and so therefore it's an abuse of power to spend that money to lock in their dominance and market share. That's broadly the argument. What is fascinating is you can make the argument the other way around. Especially in the US market, Apple is pretty dominant. iPhones are everywhere. It's less than 50%, I think, in the UK and Europe, but it's much, much higher in the US market. And in particular, there are, without getting into the green bubble, blue bubble thing, there's an iMessage lock-in. There's a kind of particular, Apple has been accused of anti-competitive practices as well. What happens when you have two monopolies, each abusing the other? And Ben Evans' speculation was this question of, is this Google abusing its market power, or is this in fact Apple abusing its market power? And the only reason they can charge Google to be the default is because their users are locked in, not going anywhere, and they're abusing their market power in that way. And my argument is that kind of mean, why not both? Again, without being an antitrust lawyer, it doesn't seem to me to be mutually exclusive. It doesn't prevent the fact that one is potentially abusing its power, doesn't actually prevent the fact that the other one is taking up the deal, couldn't also potentially be against the rules. So here we get into the crux of things. Bring it into land, Will. What are we talking about here? What is actually going to be the effect for marketers in the short to medium term? So not 5 years down the line when every appeal is exhausted and all of the remedies have been argued to death and so forth. Two things I think could happen more quickly than that, which I think is very interesting to pay attention to. So to be clear, I don't think anything changes today and tomorrow. Like your tactics don't change. I don't think your strategy changes. I think Google's dominance remains, and I wouldn't be reallocating any budget, effort, or headspace based on this right now. What I'm predicting is potential changes that might lead to things that further down the line may lead to those tactical changes, or those behavior changes. So two things in particular. One is, we've seen in Europe in the past that when Google loses these cases, which they have done in the past, they sometimes take preemptive measures even before they're forced to. I assume the belief is that if they do these things willingly, early, and under their own volition, they can A, shape what the remedy is, B, get a softer, nicer, more friendly to them version of the remedy, and they can frustrate the efforts that are being made to kind of push them down an avenue they don't want to go down. And a skeptic might say, in certain cases, they have engaged in a touch of malicious compliance. You see this around some of the product search options in the European market in particular. And they've complied with the letter, but maybe not the spirit of the penalty. Point being, what I would anticipate here is that there may be some changes to Google's approach, even before they're mandated. I don't know exactly what those would be, but I don't think they will look like the DOJ's perfect remedy. And I'm not deep enough or not expert enough in the law to know what might be sufficient. But leading into the second thing, I could see from either side, from either Apple or Google, the removal of this big payment. In particular, if Apple believes it's going away, because that may be one of the remedies, is that Google may not be allowed to pay this anymore, they may preemptively say, well, fine, we're either going to start taking that payment from smaller players. Obviously, it would be a smaller payment, but it would be proportional to their size and would be the beginnings of a different approach. Or they start preferencing their own stuff. I mean, this actually could lead to antitrust issues in the other direction for Apple and the bundling of an Apple search engine. They seem to have got away with bundling Apple Maps, but this is exactly what Microsoft got in trouble for in the 90s when they bundled Internet Explorer with the dominant Windows platform of the day. So if that deal went away, we may see it may not be Google's actions, it could be Apple's actions that lead to either an explosion of new entrants or the growth of the Apple search engine. We've talked about this, speculated about this on the SearchPilot site. My colleague, CTO at SearchPilot, Tom Anthony, has written an article about this and given a deep dive presentation in what an Apple search engine might and could look like. They have a lot of the building blocks already, and you can find that if you search the SearchPilot website for Apple. We've got a search in the articles section. So yeah, the soonest impact I might anticipate would be something around changes on iOS in particular, and whether that is mandated by the judge, whether it's voluntary from Google, whether it's voluntary from Apple, whether it's some kind of different agreement between Apple and Google. I don't know exactly what that could look like. I'm not super bullish that it's actually going to result in the Cambrian explosion of new search engines necessarily, because I think if certainly if it's driven from Google's side, they're very, very clever at the way they structure proposed remedies and responses in ways that can lead to the outcome they want. So I think the only time this really affects marketers, if it's led by Google, nothing much will change. They'll find a clever way of making it so that same old, same old. What's more interesting to me is if this triggers a change from Apple outside of Google's control. And I've been very interested in, I do think one of the possible outcomes of this case is Google is no longer allowed to pay to be the default provider on iOS, and yet retains 90% of that market anyway through user preferences. And basically this deal becomes a $20 billion a year bonus to Google, which I think would be ironic, but certainly would be fascinating. The final effect that I'm less qualified to comment on is an effect in the advertising market. So Google's paid search ads. This is the market that they're being accused of abusing and in particular charging too much in. And we may see some kind of tactical short-term changes there, again, driven by Google trying to get ahead of the curve, ahead of the game, and make those changes before they're forced to. But I'm not expert enough to know exactly what that might look like. But I think the thing I would most keep an eye on right now is not the appeal. It's actions Google takes, but the most important thing is actions Apple takes. Is Apple going to drop this deal because they see it as too much of a risk, or because they see it as an opportunity to stop having to pay so much money and get basically the same user happiness? Sorry, the other way around. The money flows the other way. So is Apple going to drop it because they are going to be forced to, and therefore they know that revenue is going away to them, and so they see it as an opportunity to say, well, if the revenue is going away anyway, we might as well boost our search engine and get at least the paid search revenue potentially. Eventually, we'll build that stream rather than relying on the revenue until it's yanked away by some judge further down the line. And what I think is interesting is, the implications the other way around, is if Apple were to do that, is that in fact a negative on Google or not? Or is it actually, it turns out they'd be paying all this money and they would get 80 or 90% of that benefit anyway? And I think that's really what we need to keep an eye on. So to summarize, it's a huge judgment, and it is going to lead to change, and it definitely is going to lead to changes within Google. To what extent that affects searchers and search advertisers is the bigger question. It's absolutely going to put pressure on Google, but the outcomes range from actually a benefit to them because they're forced to stop paying Apple for something they don't need to pay for, through to a much more disruptive, as I said, some of the remedies being bandied around are even as far as a breakup, which my money would not be on that right now, but we'll see where that all goes. Final thing for me on this topic is I just want to touch on the in my opinion absolutely wonderful statement that Google put out so this was from Kent Walker, the president of global affairs at Google, who put out a statement that is just wonderfully I don't know, I'm not a lobbyist. Maybe this is speaking exactly to the people and the constituency that it needs to, but I think to many in the search industry and myself and folks like me, it comes across as a little insensitive or a little tone deaf. So they basically said that this decision recognizes that Google offers the best search engine, but concludes that we shouldn't be allowed to make it easily available, which I think is not, shall we say, not exactly the Steelman version of that argument. And they've cherry picked a couple of quotes saying they appreciate things about the court finding, about how they've invested in innovation in search and how they've improved things for their users. And as this process continues, they will remain focused on making products that people find helpful and easy to use. So that's nice. Unicorns and rainbows, everyone's a friend in this situation. I think under the surface, there's going to be a lot of scrabbling going on. And that's probably the biggest thing I'm going to leave you with as marketers is this means turbulence of some kind. There's changes at Google, whether it's structure changes, whether it's revenue changes, whether it's cost changes if they stop having to pay Apple or stop being able to pay Apple, whether it's preemptive changes they make to try and get ahead of the remedies, so that they can say, well, look, we've done all these things to improve the situation. You can't do the most extreme remedies because we've already improved things. It's going to mean turbulence and change, and that's been a constant of all of my time in the industry over the last 20 years or so. So it probably seems at the safer end of my predictions that what we're going to see is more change. So I hope you've enjoyed that little dance through the my thoughts following the DOJ's antitrust case win over Google. As I said at the top, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in antitrust. This is coming much from the marketer's perspective and an expert in Google watching over the years. These live streams are having a little hiatus for a couple of weeks, and we'll be back in late August and early September. So if you follow me at Will Critchlow on Twitter and LinkedIn, or the YouTube channel from SearchPilot with Zach SearchPilot, then you will get everything you need. And if you head to searchpilot.com/live, you can sign up to our email list, which obviously says when these are, but also gives you access to tons of test results and SEO wins and case studies and so forth, customer stories. And if you want to see the SearchPilot Enterprise SEO testing platform in action, there's also a form there at searchpilot.com/live that you can use to do that. Have a great summer. Take care.